Good afternoon. Ladies and gentlemen, children of all ages, welcome to the greatest show on earth. Oh, that's the wrong presentation. Sorry about that. We're here about managing denials, overpayments, and recoupments. My name is Brian Panessa, like it says on my first slide, which I'm not presenting. I am a recovering healthcare lawyer, so I do know a couple things about the law, but I've been trying to give it up for about 20 years. We've got some goals today that I want to try to get through in the next hour. First and foremost, I'd like to try to help you understand why we are in this place and time related to denials, overpayments, and recoupments. There's a lot of forces and factors that have occurred over the last 10 years that's changed the landscape as we know it. And we're going to talk a little bit about, hey, where did we come from? What kind of things triggered these changes, and what direction are we moving? What are those market forces? The second thing I want to talk about is how those contracts that you're all in with payers affect your ability to actively and efficiently defend denials, defend overpayments, and recoupments. There's a lot of detail in those contracts that you have that both can be hurtful and helpful, and we're going to talk a little bit about that today. And last, I want to try to leave you on a positive note and try to give you some good advice and some good examples on how to fight the good fight when it comes to denials and recoupments and overpayments. This is a pretty big topic as far as how important it is to payers, to providers, to health entities across the country. It's estimated that upwards of $600 billion is going to either be denied or sought for overpayment this year alone. So I mean, we're talking about a very large portion of every dollar that's coming into the health system. So why is it so big? You know, obviously it's a revenue generator for payers. It's a way for those payers to either increase their profit margin or to control cost. And so we have those effects in that revenue cycle management. And what's more important in your revenue cycle management approach than cash flow, right? And understanding how you go about preparing for these denials, overpayments, recoupments. As we'll talk about, it is regulation induced for the most part. We're going to talk about some key things, for example, the Affordable Care Act, that caused the current environment that we're in, and you'll get to see those things that in the statutes that actually cause overpayments to have risen dramatically. What's tough about denials and overpayments? Well, it costs money to defend them. You have to take time, it's people, it's energy. So approximately 65% of all practices out there don't file appeals on denials. Think about that, upwards of 65%. So my goal today, at the end of the day, is I'm hoping that you're in the 35% and that we're all going to have a plan to deal with that 35%. Because if you think about it, as a health insurance carrier, if I know statistically 65% of you are not going to file your appeal, that's a pretty good way for me to generate revenue. Just issue denials and overpayments and not have any response. We'll get a little bit into the variation on the look-back period, and I'm sure you've heard about the Medicare look-back and when you're supposed to identify overpayments. And we'll talk a little bit about that and kind of give you some up-to-date guidelines or recommendations as to what the case law actively is supporting today about what does that mean, that 60 days, and what kind of obligations do you have to make sure that you're monitoring for overpayments. All right, so how do we get here? So if anyone was fortunate enough to be around in the 90s, as I was, dealing with healthcare issues, you will remember that denials ruled the roost. Denials was the name of the game. You really very rarely saw overpayments unless it was a straight fraud type application where the services weren't performed or there was some element that was truly fraudulent. How did we defend these denials? Well, typically your basic response was to send the medical records in, right? Our medical records are going to have the documentation that's going to allow us to get paid. And fortunately, in the 90s and early 2000s, that was successful. traditionally anywhere from 50 to 70% of the time. By sending those medical records, you would get paid. Unfortunately, as we'll see, that's no longer a good strategy as a starting point on how to deal with denials or overpayments. So let's talk about the good old days. You know, like it says, who doesn't miss being able to push somebody in the pool and not worrying about their cell phone in their pocket? I do. The good news is I think with the iPhone 10, it's waterproof, so now your friends who have those, you can now push them back in the pool. So it's come full circle. What is under in the False Claims Act 2009, pre-2009, really what was required was that intent. A false statement on your provider's or your practice's part or your organization's part. It was an active action of you doing something to try to prevent having to pay money back to the government or trying to obtain money. The important key there, distinction is there is an active event, something that you did intentionally. So that's a little bit about the governmental application there. What about the commercial carriers? How are they managing that process? So when you're looking at a denial strategy pre-2012, really the goal was the more I deny, the more revenue I get to keep at the insurance carrier level, and so the more money I make. So it's a very simple equation. They take in premiums, and then they try to potentially pay as little as possible or deny, and that creates that separation. So the incentive pre-2012 was to go ahead and make sure that we had our denial processes as payers as tight as possible so that we could create that revenue gap. We could make that profit, and that was the way the system was incentivized, is to create the spread to be able to be profitable. Obviously, increased denials meant increased revenue. Really not big on the overpayment strategy at that point. We really didn't see that come into full bore. I have a train in the back that's going to take everybody around if you get bored with my speech, so don't worry about that. Yeah, it is not Disneyland though. I think it circles like 6 bars in the area, but so basically the overpayment strategy was, hey, once again, just like the federal government, we're talking about fraud cases and how they can potentially obtain those monies back. So what happened? How did we suddenly go from a denial aspect to then moving towards an overpayment aspect? The Affordable Care Act caused basically a fundamental change in how insurance companies viewed that payment process. It basically did 2 things. One, it took it from action to inaction. So basically you were, instead of having to, the state or the federal government having to prove that you did something wrong and you intentionally did it wrong, now your inaction to do something could cause liability, which that's a big, huge distinction, because basically they don't have to prove that you did something wrong intentionally. Now they can just say you should have known better and you shouldn't have done that, even though it wasn't an intentional act. So basically it was, hey, you didn't get this medical necessity right. It could now lead to liability under the Federal Claims Act. So that's a big paradigm switch. What's Medicare? When you're looking at overpayment, obviously Medicare rules are typically a nice starting point when we're going to talk about what commercial carriers do, how are other organizations going to look at it. And so here, if you look at what our Medicare final rule says, it says overpayment is identified when the person has or should have, through the exercise of reasonable diligence, determined that the person has received an overpayment and quantified the amount of overpayment. This was definitely written by a lawyer for sure. Okay. And I can tell you the word reasonable diligence, if I had $1 for every time lawyers got paid to argue about reasonable diligence, we could probably pay off the debt for the country. So it's a situation where these are terms of art that are put into statutes so that there are arguments both sides. But what is reasonable diligence? That's really been starting to be litigated over the last 4 or 5 years of what is really required from you or your practice. What kind of things are they looking at?